Welcome to Living Web Farms. I'm thrilled to have Mark here. I met Mark about 2 years ago, I guess, right?
It was just last year, wasn't it? At the
Year and a half.
Year and a half ago. Okay, seems like even more than
I remember you telling me about it.
Yeah. At the Mother Earth News Fair, and he was with the group that had this very neat machine that you'll get to see, that's a pyrolyzer that makes biochar, electricity, hot water, and a pound of biochar an hour. And so he was with those people. He was the biology part of them, what to do with the biochar. We got talking and I realized, wow, there's an awful lot of information this guy's got about a lot of the pieces we're going to need. With that, I'm going to let Mark get going.
Okay. Well, thanks, Pat. Thanks for coming out. You've got a nice crowd on such a nice day. We're going to be talking about regenerative agriculture, and I'll read this in a moment. My take on regenerative agriculture is probably broader than anybody you're going to talk to. I'm looking at the really big picture here, as I really think we need strategy. We're coming into some very challenging times. So I'll go ahead and read this, and I'll give you a background on my story in a moment. But and this is a statement by a guy named Ethan Soloviev, just to give him credit for it. Regenerative agriculture is a system of farming principles and practices that increases biodiversity, enriches soils, improves watersheds, and enhances ecosystem services. Regenerative agriculture aims to capture carbon in soil and above ground biomass, reversing current global trends of atmospheric accumulation. At the same time, it offers increased yields, resilience to climate instability, higher health, vitality of farming and ranching communities. The system draws from decades of scientific and applied research by the global communities of organic farming, agroecology, holistic management, and agroforestry. I think that says it pretty well for the territory that I'm going to get into, except I think I would like to try to get at something that's a little harder and usually not addressed. And I think that it has to do with what keeps us going despite the odds, what keeps us going for life regardless of what comes up. And I don't think that it's easy to put a finger on. I was in Tibet in about 1996, and I came back, and I read this book, which really was impressive, called The Heart of the World. And what I really liked about it, it was simultaneously talking about Shangri-La, and it was simultaneously a geographical and a psychological way of entering this space. And I think that's the kind of place that I want to get into a little bit here, because I really think that our perception of who we are and our relationship to the biosphere, to the living world that we're in, is really what we're addressing here. We're talking about soils and this, that, and the other, but we're really regenerating our relationship to the biosphere and moving back toward something that I think where we originally came from, which had a lot more to do with symbiotic relationship than just full-on destruction, which is where we've arrived. And it's a tall order because the sheer numbers of people we have in the biosphere and the food pyramid as it is, never in the natural world do you have millions of carnivores. You just don't see millions of lions in the Serengeti and actively undermining the base that it's drawing from, which is kind of where we're at. So in order to connect some of these dots, I recently read a very interesting piece in Psychology Today that had to do with an experiment where they were able to fundamentally change the social interaction of autistic mice with one species of microbe in the microbiome. And it opened up a window. I was up until probably 4 in the morning just kind of putting all these things together, because what it was really saying is that the vagus nerve, people familiar with the vagus nerve? It surrounds the brain and it connects the heart, which is a huge piece of what we're generally missing, and the gut. And so they were able to interact with this bidirectional flow up the vagus nerve from the gut by increasing the diversity, which is really the principle that generally fixes almost everything, is to increase diversity in it, whether that's the gut, the soil, the vegetative architecture, etc. So the thing that's interesting about that, other than the obvious, is that there's also an informed, a process of our gut microbiome being informed by the soil microbiome through our food, even through just breathing when you're walking in a forest. The forest bathing is a thing now, but you're integrating all kinds of microbial life into your genetic process. So we're about 1% human in that sense, that we're carrying a load of a tremendous amount of living material. So this, I guess it's not a word, but I guess I'll call it neurobiogeography is a territory that I feel like has affected me tremendously in my process, coming up from a very early age as a child. I think most children are really curious about the natural world, and I was very fortunate to have parents that cultivated that. My father was a scientist, my mother was an artist, so I was getting really nice tools on both sides of the brain, which is a lot of where we're going to need to go here, is to integrate connection. And so one of the things we're regenerating is connection and communication, so that bidirectional flow is connecting the brain with the gut and the heart and these sensory systems that we have that are reading the environment. And I think that we tend to let the brain lead too much. It doesn't have to. It can actually be following other parts of that neurobiological system. So the other part of the article that was really interesting was it was talking. The guy who wrote it was he was into peak performance, athletic and mental performance, and he created this bell curve where on one end, pretty dysfunctional, was not enough stimulation, and the other dysfunctional end was overstimulated. And cortisol and adrenaline coming up to the peak point, and that's really the optimum. So cortisol and adrenaline are yang, and they are tonic up until you get to the peak. Once you go over the peak, you're losing it. But the thing that's interesting is that through some breath work, you can trigger acetylcholine, which is a yin compound. So there's the sympathetic nervous system on the yang side and the parasympathetic nervous system being activated here. I just thought that was pretty fascinating, that with just being conscious of where you are in that balance, because much of what we're going to be talking about has to do with balance. But getting back to what I feel like was, I've tried to figure out how I got to where I am. And it's interesting looking back to your childhood in this, because I remember moments of like seeing my first brook trout, or just randomly dipping a net into a pond and seeing a painted turtle, and later a series of encounters with animals that really affected me. There was a time when I was coming home at night. We had a long row of huge oak trees coming back. I was about 8 or 10, and I had a treehouse and an apple tree in the backyard, and the headlights were on it. And I'm naturally looking at it, and this white head pops out, and then dives out and takes two swipes, and it was out over the lake. It was a snowy owl, but I mean, I had this like eye contact, and things like that is almost like a dream. And I've had actually dream experiences as well. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this, but later in life, I also had some very powerful experiences with animals. And so it wasn't just the animal, it was the habitat and the environment that I was in for this experience. These things eventually affected me to go into wildlife biology and to begin studying the conditions by which any particular animal would thrive because of its habitat. And the part that really stunned me at the time was that this idea of carrying capacity, that the landscape has a capacity to support life, and that can be altered. Obviously, it can be altered in a downward spiral, which we know from the historic writings, what the Europeans found when they first came here and what it is now. It's been highly negatively affected. So that tells me that we can bring it back the other way, and that's really what I was studying. So I got into these bigger and bigger composites of species to where we could manage large systems and bring the whole system up to support life. Because really, where we're at right now, from an ethical perspective, there's not too many things you can do in terms of lowering the human population other than choosing not to procreate and to raise the capacity for more life. So that's where I found myself, and I got through that program, and then I asked this question of what is human habitat? What is the kind of human habitat that creates healthy bodies and minds more often than not? And that was a very esoteric question in academia. And I did not find too much in the way of answers. So I formed my own set of studies, which was like a fusion of anthropology, botany, and philosophy. That took me into all kinds of interesting territory, because I knew at that time that the conditions were extreme. I mean, I knew when I was a teenager that this was a mental health epidemic globally. I was yet to find the pockets where they were functional. So I found a real deep need to get to functional reference points, both biological and cultural, and the interface between the two. And that was not something you generally read in the news or have access to unless you go out into the bush in a really serious way. At that point, I found myself being very interested in growing things. I started to got my first beehives and gardens and a horse and so forth, and I was renting and still going to school. Then I co-founded an intentional community, a community land trust in the early 80s. And right about the same time, I became aware of what was really going on in the tropics, partly because of the incredible diversity in the tropical rainforest. But also I needed to kind of see an indigenous lifestyle that wasn't subsidized. And what I mean by that is that it's really difficult to see through the conditioning that we've been born into here of the sheer amount of energy going into everything. So I just needed to take all that off. And initially I moved into the woods and cut some teepee poles and moved into a teepee. I had no running water, or phone or electricity for 10 years while I was paying off the land because I didn't have a lot of money. And that was a strategy to get to freedom. People ask me, what do I grow? And I say, well, my first crop is freedom, and after that it's whatever I want to do. And I think that that's not an easy thing to do in this society. I work with a lot of farmers. I've been inspecting organic farms over about half the country for 28 years now. I've been living off the grid for almost 40. And so I get this nice view into what everybody's doing out there. I mean, I consider myself a cross-pollinator. I visit thousands of farms and talk to lots of people and meet a lot of animals and plants and crops and processing facilities. And so I wind up working with a lot of Amish folks, and I think they're kind of a sleeper right under our nose about a group of people that somehow hasn't taken the bait in a sense. They stayed responsible for their own needs. And they have some things that we'll get into, I think, a little bit later about the distributed generation of the things that we need. It's basically comes down to don't put all your eggs in one basket, and that's exactly what every civilization has done that's collapsed for that reason. You would think that would be something that would be better understood, but we generate power in centralized ways and makes us very vulnerable. And food, we've got under 2% of the population growing food. There's no possible way that can end well. There's no reference points in history for even 20 times that that's done well. So I mean, we're just literally living in la-la land here. So when I look at these farms where I can drive miles, this is in this country, drive miles and miles past essentially landscapes that are providing just about everything that people need in a really distributed way, that people aren't running to the store every 2 days to buy packaged things that came from an average of 1,300 miles away, and on and on and on. This is this subsidy thing I was mentioning. So then I decided in the early 80s to take a trip to Central America as I became aware of what was happening there, where to put your shoulder to the wheel in a sixth extinction spasm of this planet's history, and it's basically like a triage type thinking. What can you do with what time that you have? Before we get to that, I realized I just wanted to say that we're going to, talking a lot about soil. Soil is the central nexus of almost all of these pieces that we'll be looking at. And I missed it for a long time. I basically was focusing on above ground things that I could see in this wildlife biology story. And it wasn't really until I went to the tropics that I had to really look at that being a subsidy as well. And in the design of getting around needing that, because you have to not completely, and I'll show you some examples of that. But basically, there's a demonization of carbon in the way people are talking about it these days. And I just wanted to mention that carbon is who we are, is what we're made of. The anthropologist Wade Davis once said that the spirit rides the horse of matter, in which I would say carbon in this case. So these are incredible spirits that are riding this matter, and we have greatly mismanaged the historic habitats and the species and the beings that we share this planet with. And so this gets back to that process of connecting and being in communication. And there's something that happens in this, or it happened for me, where a dissolution of the sense of, a small sense of self that I had been trained or taught or conditioned to think I was, that I was somehow inside of my skin and everything else was not me. And that can dissolve with certain types of experiences where ultimately you fall in love with life, and then you will fight for that for the rest of your life. And I think that's what I was trying to get in that first slide too. So yeah, miraculous, incredible planet, just full of everything we could ever hope for, and it's really way past time to take care of it and regenerate as much as we possibly can. And luckily, there's a tremendous amount that we can do. I mentioned that first part partly because when I get hopeful when I look at all the things that I know about that can turn things around quite quickly. But where I find that it's a bottleneck for me is I start thinking, okay, we can lay all that out, we can do that, but then who's going to actually do it? And the limitations that I see are, you start looking at the populations like, okay, you got people that are too young, you got people that are too old, you got people that are too sick, you got people that are, and that's a big category, and too far in debt. A lot of the farmers that I work with, they know the right thing to do, but they can't do it. They can't afford to do it. They got to take that loan. They got to just get through that next year, and they know better, but they don't have that freedom that I mentioned. And so getting...
Contradiction.
It's a contradiction, but it's basically addiction. Yes, it absolutely is. It's the addiction psychology is really deep in this. I guess I'll say it now. So I set up this program in Central America, and I was doing these experiential curriculums, and they went real deep into how to grow and make everything in your world from the landscape around you on foot with hand tools. And I was explaining the curriculum. It was very powerful. We did this for 25 years in Central America. And I went to Harvard, and I talked to these two psychology professors that when we got into talking about the experiential curriculum, they were like, holy crap, they didn't even know of anything like that. But they understood it instantly. And we came away from that conversation realizing that even though I was teaching things like tropical forest ecology, ethnobotany, agroforestry, these types of topics, what was really happening in this experiential process was more like a 12-step program for fossil fuel addiction combined with a cult deprogramming process of a cult of materialism, and combined with a crash course in ecological literacy. And I do think that is what was more accurate. So I wanted to peel off the stuff that was, I felt, keeping me from seeing clearly. And what I mean by that is that the agricultural system that I generally look at has between 10 and 20 calories going in to every one coming out. And I did some public speaking at Penn State about 24 years ago in the engineering department. And it struck me that these terms that we describe people of underdeveloped and primitive and backward and uneducated, these same people that I worked with in all those categories were using a 50th of a calorie of energy to produce one. And so the educated, high-tech, et cetera, developed people were 1,000 times less efficient just from a thermodynamic perspective. This was before we got into the ethics. The course was the ethics in the design of technology and international technology transfer. And so the deeper end of that course had to do with genetic erosion, soil erosion, et cetera, and much more complex things. But it followed suit. So people familiar with the country of Belize, where that is, in the very southern part near the Guatemala border. It's an interesting area because it's kind of the northernmost point of its type of forest, tropical forest, where it gets kind of scrubby and dry forest up further north in the Yucatan. But also, I found out later that it's basically a Pleistocene refugia, which is kind of like the place in the creek that dries up, but the pool is still enough to, thank you. So right in here, where the species through ice ages are kept in a moist and warm enough environment where the tropical species can sustain, as opposed to turning into, in the Petén in Guatemala, be turning into more of a grassland or a savanna. And so these are kind of important places. You find around the planet that things aren't evenly distributed. We'll talk later about the centers of genetic diversity of our food crops and things like that. So these are all things that we can consider in our strategy of what we will do. So the farm set up a nonprofit organization. It was a membership organization. It's kind of fallow right now, but it's possible it could be reactivated if the right group of people came about. But it's up a beautiful river, and you go by dugout canoe to get to. There's no roads going to the property. It's a karst region of limestone, so there's a lot of caves and phenomenally beautiful forest and numinous wild areas in hiking within 20 miles in, which was always my favorite part. This is about a half-day hike, and then there's this underground river, and it goes for miles underground, and just the most incredible species I've ever encountered. It's a beautiful forest. So my question was, I had some experiences that went through this dissolution type of experience and got through this, went through this process of curiosity leading to this beauty and sense of wonder and gratitude and eventually a series of steps that kicked me out into this sort of regenerative stewardship place. But the thing is, the experience that I had that was so powerful, it was in a place that was incredibly beautiful, but for years later it kind of haunted me, kept coming back on me. It was a very powerful, beautiful experience, but it was that way because they had to keep my species out from living there. They had to protect this place from us from living there to be that beautiful and to have that transformative experience. And I thought, wow, I don't think that's ultimately survivable. I think that we need to get to the place where it's beautiful and healthy and incredible because we're there, not because we're kept out. Because I think subconsciously that eats away at us, whether we let it come to the surface or not. And I really believe strongly that it's behind a lot of the self-destructive habits that people have. And so we really need to make peace with both sides of our brain, the part that knows that and the part that lives in denial or sweeps things under the rug. I became very curious about whether it was possible to farm in a system where you didn't have to destroy anything that was originally there. And this place was essentially like going back in a time machine. It was virtually a lot like it was 300 years ago. Over about a 25-year period, I found that it's absolutely possible. How many people could do it, how much of a population you could sustain, That's another question. But we have 5 species of cats that come through the property. I was maintaining quite a good 20 acres of cacao and coffee, and I was just planting in hundreds of species of ethnobotanicals and fruit trees of all types, and doing it in a mimicking way of like an analog forestry to the way the forest works. So down here, it's almost like training wheels, and that in the hot tropical sun, you better have a canopy over you. You better have some shade, or you're going to bake in the dry season. Very hot. What I didn't see coming, and that's partly because there's virtually no soil. It's very, most of the wet tropics are very thin soil. So the whole kind of soil sponge situation is kind of more above ground, surface and above rather than as deep until we get to the Amazon, which we will look at. But what you find in these systems with so few nutrients and such that the design of the forest itself is creating its own rainfall. It's creating this whole nutrient cycling system. And the plants generally have secondary compounds that they produce to protect themselves from insects. And a lot of the plants that we're working with, medicinal plants and so forth, the plant actually made those compounds that are interesting to us because it was useful for them in a different way. So this is a plant, it's an acacia species that doesn't have the chemicals to protect itself. And as an alternative to chemistry to protect itself, it developed a relationship with a species of ant that lives in the hollow thorns. I don't know if you can see, you'll see a little hole that the ants will chew into those things, and they live inside of those. And the tree produces these extra floral nectaries along the leaflets, and so they're like little drinking fountains of sugar for the ants. And in exchange for habitat and food, the ants totally protect this tree. Now, you can't, if you lean on that tree and you don't get hit by a thorn, you're going to quickly get some very hot bites. We've got ants down there that make our wasps look like lightweights. And so it's just an example of symbiotic relationships which are everywhere once you start looking. It's the name of the game. I mean, basically we missed this, I think, with this very oversimplified idea of survival of the fittest. I think even Darwin, toward the end of his life, realized that he didn't say it right. And I think that my guess is that he would have added one word to that, survival of the fittest communities. Because over time, if you look at long sweeps of evolutionary time and adaptations, aggression is very often responded to with cooperative strategies for survival among the aggressed upon. It's maybe a scientific way of saying the meek shall inherit the earth or something, but you see this symbiotic systems a lot. So I do a lot of work with birds. I've worked for the Forest Service mapping bird calls, and we did some mist netting down there, looking at return rates of migratory birds and talking about reestablishing connectivity, not just in our bodies and in the connectivity of the plant to the nutrients in the soil through mycorrhizal fungi, functioning very much as a direct communication system. So the birds I see as, sort of canaries in a mine shaft in reverse in a way, because I'm looking at them not to die, but watching the new ones coming in because of the vegetative changes that we're making in the landscape, and saw tremendous changes. Bird species that 90, 100-year-old people in the village hadn't heard before. This is a painted bunting. You might get them here, I don't know, maybe a little further south. You got indigo buntings, I know. This was a bird that came out of the net one morning, and it just literally hypnotized me. I mean, it was what you can't see from a still shot is that it's just a brown drab bird, but when it folds this thing out, either when it's mating or under stress, in this case it was the stress, but it was doing this 270-degree thing with that, and it was like I just about dropped it. It had me completely mesmerized. Beautiful though. Lots of bird species. And so in beginning to really look at the management of these landscapes, it's definitely all about diversity, species diversity, about diversity within species, so intraspecific diversity, interspecies diversity. So, for intraspecific diversity, all you really have to do is look at the potato famine. Out of how many thousands of varieties of potatoes, in 4,000 to 8,000, I think, in the Andes, the Europeans brought back very few. But at the time of the potato famine, there were basically 2 varieties, one of which made 75% of all the potatoes. You just don't have enough building blocks to work your way out of any problem when you got that narrow of a gene pool. And so you want to have diversity within your varieties, you want to have lots of varieties within the landscape, and you want to have as many habitat types within that landscape as you can. When you line those things up, and then also vertical diversity. So having 5, 6 layers of above ground and then below ground diversity as well. So there's different shapes of roots, and you can be, after a while, which trees have the tap roots, which ones are more surface rooted, and you can stack things together and above and below ground. And pretty soon you've got niches for tremendous numbers of insects and birds and animals of all types. Another piece that I looked at a lot, being a beekeeper, is phenology, is fruiting and flowering phenologies, which is if you're wanting to have better nectar flow for your bees, you look at that window when they don't have much and find species of plants that are going to flower then, rather than planting more at a time that you've already got a lot, right? And so same thing with birds, the berries and the fruits that are going to fill in those gaps. And so it's really looking at, I guess that brings up the topic of limiting factors and searching for what is holding the system back, whether that be minerals in your soil or biology in your soil or species in your gut or whatever it is. There's always going to be something that a small amount, the least amount of addition that you're going to get the biggest result from, both for economic reasons and otherwise. But so stacking this, these vegetation, and I've never been I guess I'll say this part now, I've never been a fanatic about native species, but there's a very important piece to this. There's a guy named Doug Tallamy. Anybody familiar with him at the University of Delaware? He did this amazing work where he set up cameras and he watched these birds raising their young, and he watched what they brought, everything they brought to the nest over the whole period. And it was all about caterpillars, because caterpillars have amazing fat energy, and there's very little chitins and hard things to digest. It's just this soft, really nutrient-dense food. So the numbers were just stunning on how many species of, how many total caterpillars of how many species. And so he then started looking at, what species of trees supported how many species of caterpillars. The oaks are like up over 500, and cherries are really high and so forth. But what was really fascinating, he actually found the inflection point of when the bird species go into a sink. You start losing your population when you have 30% non-native trees in your area or more, and then you're going down purely because of caterpillars. So there's lots of examples to become aware of where biodiversity starts dropping off the page. We have the circuitry to understand all this and be the man. Whether we like it or not, we are the managers, and we can't just leave things to go fallow and think that's going to be okay at this point. We have to design diversity into our supply chains as the logic of having them there. So a couple years ago, I went to a ginseng conference in West Virginia. And I work with a lot of herbalists, and I'm on the advisory board of United Plant Savers, which is working to conserve endangered medicinal plant species. So it was a fascinating conference because there was such a range of people there. Had just diggers to law enforcement and researchers and growers and everybody in between. And the interesting thing about it was that it was everybody agreed that they all wanted ginseng in the picture going forward, and it was that kind of a curve. And just look at historic populations and what it is now, and it's down to the last kind of thing in the wild. So the conference was really about how do we build a supply chain that regenerates that species. And it's really relevant because we're in the same set of conditions with fisheries, with logging jobs in a lot of part of the country. So many things have been mismanaged historically down to just really minimal levels. And it's not that big a deal to understand the biology of that species to create a supply chain that demands that it is regenerating. So there was a program started a couple years ago through PCO in Pennsylvania, another organic certifier, where they added this shade-grown ginseng. And I offered to do some of that because it's an excuse to get into the woods and get paid for it. And so I was thinking that it was going to be more along the lines of what I had developed for chocolate, for cacao. I had developed a whole criteria matrix for what, one of my earliest students from Vermont turned up about 8 years later with a chocolate company up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he now does Theo chocolate out in Seattle. And he basically hired me to say, let's create a management matrix for how to do cacao in a way where there's so much diversity, and that if we were going to be alive in 100 years, what would it look like? And so I got into that pretty far, and it had to do with these the diversity at the different levels and the vertical nature and the many other pieces, and identifying the farmers in a given region that you're going to buy from that are doing it right, and then taking them out of production and having them be extension people to get everybody else up to that speed kind of thing. So I thought I was going to get into that with ginseng. It's a lot simpler. Basically, I was going out and mapping the population and then looking at the number that was to be harvested that year, what are they doing with the seeds, and so forth and so on. It was fairly simplistic, but it did look a little bit at the canopy and the vegetation, because it's really this indicator species. It's like it takes the whole mature forest and soils to have a space for that plant. And so it's like the bird in that sense. This was some wild cacao, Theobroma cacao, that found like 20 miles into the jungle. And it was a remnant cacao from the ancient Mayan people. So collecting seeds and trying to stabilize some of this. This is like one of the white Criollo varieties that generally went out of production favor because it was more susceptible to disease, and they went into these hybrids and like all the other crops. But again, the cacao was the thing that when I first went down there that I looked at and said, wow, that's like the perfect example of this thing that I had been having to describe, but to try to get to people. People understand economics, they understand to some degree, and that the difference between principal and interest in a bank account, that you can pull the interest off every year and not wear down your principal, right? But so ginseng is like that. At least you're not wearing down the forest principle. You can wear down the principle of the genetic stock of the plant. See what I'm saying? So cacao is like that. So you're picking these pods off of that tree, which is in an understory with 5-6 layers of vertical structure above it, and it's a perfect model. But if you start cutting down those mahogany trees because they're worth so much money right now, instead of looking at what they're going to give you over a long period of time, this is the thing that I think people have a hard time with is time. They're looking at very short windows of economic time and needing to have payback too quickly. So they gouge. They take more than the system can give, force milk cows to produce more milk than they should, and they live a quarter as long, and they're sick all the time, right? So there's history. The recent history of civilization is about forcing nature to do more than it's really designed to, and wearing it down to this point where we need to redesign the supply chains.